I'll
There will be a pop-up come that
Hmm.
set aside.
That's great. But then I think I will start by saying welcome to the seminar today. This is an kind of an unusual day for our seminar, but it's because we have special guests, and it's going to be a very interesting day, I think. Um, it's it's a presentation of the project, The Textual History of the Ethiopic Old Testament. And Ralph Lee, whom we all know, is going to present this to us together with Steve Delamarter, who is Emeritus Professor of Old Testament at Portland Seminary in Oregon. He's also director of the Ethiopic Manuscript Imaging Project, and he's many other things too, which I I think he can inform us about. He's a well merited person in Ethiopic studies for sure. And so they will present this to us first, and then Calum has agreed to respond a little bit after that. And I suppose finally we'll have more of an open discussion or conversation. But Steve and Ralph, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Good. So, I'll kick off, shall I, Steve? Shall we?
Yeah.
We're on script now. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Thank you for that welcome, and dear friends. And it's nice to call you friends. Getting to know everybody better at Sank Ignatios is a great privilege. We're the members of the THEOT team. So Daniel, some of you have met, was with you at Sank Ignatios in May from Addis Ababa, and Steve has already been introduced, and then Gary Jost. And myself. There are lots of other people who've been involved in this project, and you'll see some of their faces later on. We've actually been working together on this project now for 13 years, until a year and a half ago, Kurt Nickham, who's at Abilene Christian University in Texas, also worked with us, but he had to withdraw from the project for reasons of health. We'd like to begin our presentation today with an exercise that will introduce several things about our project. We hope the exercise is fun and informative. It will be an inductive exercise. That is, we're going to look at one of the completed products of our working methodology and see how much we can figure out just by studying it without much explanation from us. Here is an example of one of the primary outputs of the project. So I think, Steve, you're going to share that, yes?
Yeah. Let me go ahead and share my screen here and very good. Are we ready to jump in, Ralph?
Yeah, ready to jump into the dendrogram.
Yeah. So as Dr. Lee mentioned, this is what we call a dendrogram. It's a report that's prepared, a statistical report. It's actually a visual representation of a set of numbers. And for this first little part of the exercise, I'd like to invite people to, if this would be okay, we're going to try to see what we can understand simply by looking at things. And rather than me explaining things, I'd like to have us focus on different parts of the report and see if it's self-evident what the meaning of this thing ultimately is, and if we can take in its various nuances as we focus on different parts of the thing. So we'll start here. We see something like this and ask ourselves, what does it mean? And actually, I'll say this, that if one knows how to look at these things and read them, you're actually looking at a very elaborate model that gives a lot of information about the textual history of the Ethiopic book of Hosea. Let's start by focusing our attention on this part of the thing over here. and there's a couple of words and some numbers and a sort of scale thing. Anybody willing to jump in and tell us the obvious? What is this indicating to us?
You mean the one, the many numbers or anything?
The red boxes around the item that we're focusing on right now.
I would say that the brackets which are higher up indicate higher divergence or differences between manuscripts, and the lower down you come, the closer to each other the manuscripts are.
Nicely done. That's exactly right. If someone said to you, "Well, look at this. The history of the text in Ethiopia is just riddled with diversity. Half of all the manuscripts differ from one another by 50% or so." How would that be a misreading of this dendrogram? So you look at all of this down here, and eventually we'll identify it as the divergence. On this particular screen we're looking at right now, the top of the dendrogram, except for this little bit that goes out here, right? The top is kind of about here, and that lines up with about, on this particular one, 18%. It's usually about 15%. What does that tell you about the general diversity within the tradition compared to the general uniformity? Is this yeah, so here's another clue. Dendrogram, we usually look at the bottom of a dendrogram. In matter of fact, we so are accustomed to ignoring the tops of dendrograms that it may not be obvious that this scale goes all the way to 100%, right? And were we to actually present the top part of the dendrogram and see these lines over against the total thing, it would become obvious that there's a whole lot of white at the top. And that white is what represents the uniformity, and it stretches all the way, like I say, up to 100%. So if seeing that is to see the single most important thing to know about the Ethiopic Old Testament textual tradition.
Would you say that 60% of the manuscripts differ by less than 20%?
Yeah, I would have thought it's more like 85. Now we have these two here. We have these two are kind of outliers.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Another way to put it is that 85% of all the words in all the manuscripts, except for these two, share the same root, and that all the diversity within the tradition happens in this final 15%. That is, I believe, a statement of the profound uniformity of the tradition overall. This is a traditional culture, very committed to its text. There is diversity in the end. Some parts of the tradition are unaware of that. But you can't overestimate the amount of difference. There's actually a tremendous amount of uniformity. Let's focus in on, so we see that this part of the thing helps us to get oriented to the totality of the tradition and the uniformity and the diversity that exists within the tradition. Clear enough?
And Steve, excuse me, Steve, I'll just point out at this point, and you may be getting to this, this is not a stemma. Superficially, it may look like a stemma, but this is merely showing how similar or how different the various manuscripts are from each other.
Yeah. So that begins to, a second pretty obvious thing then is we got a whole bunch of stuff along the bottom here. Is it self-evident what each of these tags or labels represent?
Manuscripts.
Manuscripts, yes. And there are 34 of them were we to count them. And you'll see there's 3 pieces of information in each tag. Somebody have a comment? 3 pieces of information in each tag: witness number, a siglum made up of a kind of a shelf mark, an abbreviated shelf mark, and then a date. So that gives us an idea. Eventually, we'll focus in on chronology, but for right now, we simply see, is anyone familiar enough with the history of scholarship to know for text critical studies or for construction of critical editions of the text, how many manuscripts are used, have been used across the years? In the 19th century, it would have been very common for an edition to be published called the Ethiopic book of such and so, and based on maybe 3 or 4 manuscripts, sometimes just 1 or 2. A manuscript without a context, it's very hard to say exactly what it is and what it represents. Why does it matter? Why does it matter how many manuscripts we have? Here now we're beginning to wander over into one of the most fundamental aspects of our project, is that it is based on all of the assumptions of the field of statistics. In the end, we have some things we want to say about the population of manuscripts of the Ethiopic book of Hosea in this case. And we can't look at all of them. We can't gather them from across time or across the world. Instead, we've created a sample of 34 manuscripts. And as I say, 34 actually represents about double the most that's ever been done. 18, I think, for the book of Ezekiel in terms of a published critical edition. But it's it also surpasses a magic number in statistics about the number 30. The number 30 is if you're flipping coins one after another, you spent a day flipping coins and keeping a record of how many times you got 10 in a row that were all heads, or 15 in a row. How many times could you get 10 or 15 in a row in one day? Could you get, and it's actually surprisingly not difficult to get up to 10, 15 in a row per day. But the chances of you flipping the coin 30 successive times is approximate to the number of atoms in the universe, which is to say, not very. So when you surpass 30, the possibility that you have a sample that doesn't represent some of the fundamental aspects of the population is very, very small indeed. And that's why it was important for us to surpass this magic threshold of 30. Now, if that's enough, that's going to be one of the questions that we're looking forward to, is talking with statisticians and others, and time will tell if it holds up, if this representation has a large enough sample to truly represent the population in a way that's accurate. What do all of these lines represent up here above the list of manuscripts? Again, we're stating the obvious, but it helps to try to put it into words.
It shows which manuscripts are closest to each other, and then which groups are closest to each other.
Wonderful. Now, we haven't actually named groups yet, and we'll do that actually next. But the obvious is that things that are close together on this chart are close together in whatever it is that this chart is representing. Each of them is kind of a data point, 0 down here. So these are very close to one another. These are close, kind of close, a little bit, not as close to one another, but also not close to the others, and so on and so forth. So it becomes, lines are indicating degree of difference among the manuscripts. And when we you use the word group, we see kind of naturally that things, the technical term that people use in the English world is cluster, that there are clusters of manuscripts. All of them are marked by, generally, you can do a single cut to cut a group or a cluster off of the rest of the dendrogram. There's one exception here, this gray box. Notice we have 2 sort of outlying manuscripts that are really not a cluster. They're not similar to one another, but they're both sort of equally different from everything else, but quantitatively, but not qualitatively. But so there's this phenomena of things clustering together. As you think in history, what phenomena would be of the type that would cause groups of manuscripts to appear on this kind of a set of measures? Does this just happen randomly or coincidentally? Or what might be the kinds of historical forces or social forces that would cause things to cluster?
Maybe they were copied at the same place, the same scribes, or...
Yes, so geography is going to be one of the key suspects in this thing. And there is, for those of you that know the geographical history, historical geography of namely how things are played out on the landscape of the country, and the north and the south, and the Nile River as it passes through, and create certain geographic barriers that then organize the development of society. Chronology is going to be another. So the manuscripts cluster into groups. The placement of the manuscripts on the board indicates their proximity to the other manuscripts on the board. They show which manuscripts share the most agreement, and they form subgroups or these clusters. Look at, I put a green box here that focuses on another aspect. Instead of geography, this one now focuses on what? Again, I'm calling you to state the obvious here.
Say it loud.
Time.
Time, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, chronology. Each of these is laid out, and as you just glance across this, do you notice any patterns about time? This any patterns about time? So we see you might answer the question, what's the earliest part of the tradition for which we have records? And so you'd look for the smallest numbers, right? The century numbers, and similarly then for the higher numbers, the more recent manuscripts. Do you see any general patterns? We don't have geographic labels for this sample, but the sampling that we did go, we might say this is a tremendous coincidence that the old manuscripts cluster together. Do you see them here? 14th, 15th, 16th century, and then starting over here, all the rest that stretch out across the up to the 20th century. This is no coincidence, but it takes a while to get our heads around the fact that the old manuscripts have a particular text form, and that those aggregated together without us making them do that. It is time itself that somehow has stamped the nature of the tradition and the proximity of these individual manuscripts to one another. So we found all these 34 manuscripts. We did control for chronology, wanted to have a spread across time. Can you see are there any breaks in the history of in the textual history? What in this depiction would signify where there are major divides?
You mean time-wise, or like between 16th century or 17th century, or
Yeah.
what should we?
Whatever it is we mean, you're naming it already, because the single most interesting thing about every dendrogram we've ever produced is that there is a divide at the 16th century that marks out the single biggest generation of difference happens in this cleavage between the oldest manuscripts of the 14th to the 16th century, except for this thing, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then this other part of the dendrogram that is later. Something happened in the 16th century. And this dendrogram proves that something happened, the greatest social forces. Now, if you make this presentation of these statistical facts in front of an audience of historians who know the history of Ethiopia, instantly people will jump to the fore and begin to say, well, I know what explains that. That's when social breakdown in Ethiopia and the Portuguese arrived and there was a war between Ahmed Gran and all kinds of ideas. And you'll come up with different explanations, but no, the single biggest thing that drives the discussion is the need to talk about why did something happen? Something happened in the 16th century, and we can spend a lot of time debating what exactly were those forces. But we passed over one that's maybe not so obvious, and that is the clear chronological patterns in relationship between the clusters. We got two manuscripts sitting out here that are both marked by their late dates. And also look at this. What does this tell you, or what do you suspect about two manuscripts that lie at such great difference from the rest of the tradition? What might account for that?
Maybe they used another witness to copy it, or?
I'm hearing perhaps we're talking about the Vorlage, copied from a different origin, and you've hit right exactly. These manuscripts over here represent the manuscripts of the Ethiopian Orthodox community. These two right here are one of the major discoveries of the project. Nobody knew before that there was a separate translation project that translated into Ge'ez, the Old Testament, from based on the Latin Vulgate. These two manuscripts, produced in late 19th, early 20th century, reflect a set of a translation made from a different Vorlage, and that Vorlage we've been able to identify is the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate translated into Ge'ez, and yet the great difference you would have suspected just statistically that some very different engine would have to be behind these two sets of manuscripts for that to be the case. So this is a really interesting feature of the textual history. One tradition with a set of sub-differences, and then a very different tradition. And we've sort of sorted out some of the details about that. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it? I was not aware that the Book of Hosea was so different in Vulgate, and I assume Septuagint is the Vorlage for Orthodox tradition.
Do you hear?
Is it really that different in Vorlage?
Yes, it is. We have four manuscripts that represent the translation from the Latin Vulgate, and every one of them stands at this much difference. 44 is usually the percentage different across the board of these two. You're right about the rest of the tradition is translated from the Greek. Some time ago, near fourth, fifth, sixth centuries, that work was thought to be done.
Do we, can I ask you, do we know when they were translated and when they were translated?
We can see the dates here, late 19th century, early 20th century. The suspicion, Daniel could speak to this, is a center, a Catholic mission in Asmara that was thriving during that period of time and produced many works of scholarship. But they also had this conviction that the truest form of the text would come through the Latin Vulgate to the Ethiopic language. So here then is one of the major outputs of the project. And we got a bunch of manuscripts. They're related apparently. See, we haven't asked ourselves the question, how was this produced? What are the statistics behind this? But if indeed this is an accurate representation, it shows us something about the remnant of two great traditions. One substantial part of the tradition here, and then another interesting variation of it, that fairly recent development. This just gives information. These stars, actually, as we'll explain later, represent the best representatives of each manuscripts. And oftentimes people want to know the oldest form of the text that still is extant, and we'll find those right over here. Cluster 1 and cluster 2, very minimal differences between one another, and yet enough to detect. And the best representative of the earliest attested text is this Gunde 152 manuscript. And similarly, we could talk about. Now, all of this ultimately, we have to answer the question, well, that's very interesting. And we can see that as you learn how to read the thing, you start to see patterns and chronological patterns and clusters and so on. But does this dendrogram, wherever it came from, whatever the statistics are behind it, does it give us an accurate overview of the textual history of the Ethiopic Book of Hosea? There would be a lot of ways to try to answer that question, but our answer is going to give you an idea of how we've come at this entire exercise. In the end, it comes back to the assumptions of statistics and how it works. The short answer goes something like this. Well, yes, it probably does. It passes that threshold of 30, but only if this sample was only if this representation is based on an adequate sample of the population of manuscripts. So is that enough? And is it an adequate sample of the book? And was the data we selected for the sample, is it somehow skewing and somehow misrepresenting the textual relationships between the manuscripts? Now we've gone from textual history 101 to textual history 301. It starts to get complicated from this point. But welcome to the THEOT project. We hope you find this curious, or maybe curiosity will be a thing that'll lead us into this subject. But we understand ourselves to be a mapping project, trying to answer religious and humanities questions about texts and about history. But we do so by using digital tools and methods, interpreting according to the rules of statistical and quantitative analysis. So there's going to be kind of this digital and statistical kind of background to us talking about the history of the translation of the books and the passing on, the copying and passing on of the books of the Ethiopic Old Testament. So hopefully this little exercise gets us into some of the details of the thing, and we'll invite now some of our other participants here to step in and three things we want you to know about THEOT kind of at the outset. I think, Ralph, you're taking over here for a minute.
Yeah, so as Steve has said, there's three things we need you to know about the THEOT project. And this is, I'm suggesting you put your seatbelts on now. This is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of aspects of the project and how we get to these dendrograms that you've already been seeing. So the first question is why THEOT? We think that the Ethiopic biblical tradition is neglected and has rarely been studied for its own sake to tell its own story. In the last 35 years, virtually all the books of the New Testament have been published in a critical edition. But in the same period, we only have a few works on the Old Testament. In earlier times, those who have studied Ethiopic often did not do so for the sake of the Ethiopian tradition. Those who studied the Septuagint from a century ago up through to the mid-century have used Ethiopian manuscripts to help describe the early development of the Greek tradition from 1,000 years earlier. They read the manuscripts, but they were listening for ghosts, echoes of the ancient ancestor text built behind the Ethiopic text. In our day, people have begun to realize just how large the gap is between the origin of the Ethiopic tradition and the extant manuscripts that we hold and study. There are too many methodological problems to be able to use late medieval Ge'ez manuscripts that date starting from the 14th and 15th centuries to reconstruct the Greek Vorlage of the Ethiopic Bible. As a daughter of the Septuagint, the Ethiopic was never considered helpful for the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. So the Western world itself asks, if you can't use it to improve the text of the Greek Bible or of the Hebrew Bible, then why should a person study the Ethiopic? The manuscript traditions offer us at least two things for our consideration. We can either study the origins of the tradition, or we can study the later text forms that emerged over time. One of the most important things we've discovered is that you can't use the methods and assumptions and vocabulary of the study of origins to describe the phenomena of the emerging text. If a person only wants to know about the origins of the textual tradition, every change away from the original is regarded as a corruption. We've all heard people describe the variants in extant Ethiopic manuscripts as ongoing corruptions of the original Greek. This is very true. No Ethiopian scribe ever got up in the morning and said to his wife, "Goodbye, dear, I'm off to go and corrupt the text." We have no question about the legitimacy of the study of origins of Ethiopic tradition. In fact, in our website, you'll find nearly everything you need to construct critical editions of the earliest attainable texts of the 27 or so books we've studied. But this has not been the goal of our work. We want to understand the Ethiopic text for the sake of Ethiopic. We have tried to understand two things about the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament. First of all, what text forms existed in the manuscripts from the 14th to the 20th centuries. And secondly, what mechanisms were at work that made their text form remain constant, yet also evolve over the last 7 centuries. A quick footnote before I pass on to Gary to explain some other things. The reason we start at the 14th century is that we have almost nothing from before then, and we can explain that in more detail, but it's not an arbitrary starting point. It's what we find extant in the tradition. Over to you, Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. The second thing you need to know about the THEOT project is that our work is grounded on the foundations of statistical analysis. We want to know about the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament. In the language of statistics, all the manuscripts that carry the Ethiopic Old Testament represent the population we want to study. But according to the logic of the statistical approach, it is not necessary to look at every manuscript to know a lot about the textual history. Instead, we prepare either random samples or representative samples. In our case, we prepare representative samples that try to give a proper spread across chronology and geography. And if the sample is large enough and indeed representative of the population, we can draw conclusions about the population. And if we do it correctly, we can be quite confident of the accuracy of our claims. We use sociological models to interpret bell-shaped curves, so we must understand the statistical logic of a bell-shaped curve and how they describe the behavior of groups of scribes in the Ethiopian book culture. The more data we have, the more clearly we can know the patterns that have been durable in the tradition over time. The THEOT project reached a milestone this past year when we surpassed 1.5 million data points from the text of the manuscripts. It required the help of computers to generate the data, and if we're going to analyze these data points, it is going to require a lot of statistical analysis, data science, and data visualization, all with the help of computers. We have given ourselves to each of these areas of study. There are videos on the website that introduce all these concepts and illustrate how we put them to work for us. We will speak more about these later. And I'll mention at this point, there are over 30 hours of videos on the website.
Gary, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Did you say, so did you manually put in all this data, or have you used any AI techniques where it just reads the manuscript itself?
So that's Ralph's the expert on that, but there's a program, Transcribus, that we use to help us with transcribing the manuscripts.
Okay.
But it still needs checking, doesn't it? It's not, at best, it's 97% accurate, and at worst, if your images aren't so good, it's probably best just to copy it yourself, isn't it? So it needs a lot of work to make that be useful.
And this process of producing clean transcriptions is the single most time-intensive and labor-intensive aspect of our entire project, because it's the most important thing. Garbage in, garbage out, they say. If you put in a lot of things with errors in it, it's going to create those. We'll give more indication of that in some of the products we show here in just a little bit. But say it takes a team of people in Addis Ababa and months actually for us to produce the transcriptions and then turn those into numbers. Takes just a few minutes actually, and we'll talk more about that. But
yeah, and the number 97% accurate, in one sense, it's like, wow, that's a pretty high number, but that's simply not good enough. As Steve said, we need accurate transcriptions as the basis of our work.
Daniel?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had a connection problem, but I'm connected now. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can. Are you in a position that you're able to see the script and continue reading?
Yeah. So the third thing to know about the THEOT is that all our work is open access. I have always described our work as that our job has been through history. We now have a lot of data about the books of the Ethiopic Old Testament. We have maps. We want you to use them. So we are making many things available on the website. Among these are hundreds of transcriptions of manuscripts. Every one of them is interesting, but you learn the most about those manuscripts when you know them in their context, when you consult the maps, when you use the dendrograms and statistical reports. They will show you where each of these manuscripts fit into the emerging Ethiopic tradition in terms of what the coherence-based genealogical method, CBGM, calls the pre-genealogical profile. The THEOT data will provide the most so let's begin our tour of the website.
Some of you may be familiar with the so-called CBGM, the coherence-based genealogical method. In New Testament textual criticism, it's the major force in textual criticism, a methodological set of assumptions. And if you are familiar with that, we'll just say that the reports that we generate constitute what they call the pre-genealogical profile of the manuscripts and then of the manuscript culture. We won't get into that much more here, but if you know what that is, you'll know what the meaning of that is. Ralph, you're next.
Yeah. So we're now going to take you on a sort of tour of the website, and this is the data as we provide it, as Daniel just said, in sort of open access. So the URL of the THEOT project website is theotproject.com. If you wish to use it, that's free and available for you. As we guide you through the website, we'll work our way across the navigation tabs at the top of the homepage. These tabs are across the top of every other page in the website as well. So first we have the About tab. Under the About tab, you'll find the usual sorts of information. The Personnel page gives a picture and description of all the people who worked on the project in the past 4 years. And it's quite a number of people, including a large team of transcribers that work with Daniel in Addis Ababa. And it's important for us that those people are known. The History tab gives you the roots and background to the project, describing the developments that have led to the start of the project in 2012 and how the project has unfolded since then. Finally, under Publications tab, we have a list of the publications written by members of the team that are connected with the project in some way. Okay. And then on the Reports tab, this is where you find much of the data we have produced for the project. This is where you can learn about the discoveries we've made for more than 25 biblical books of the Ethiopic Old Testament. The reports are divided into 2 sections, Type 1 reports and Type 2 reports. The basic difference between Type 1 and Type 2 reports is the depth to which we analyze the statistical and philological data we've produced in our workflows. Let's take a look at a Type 1 report. So each one of these offers 8 key artifacts generated in our workflow, along with a video to explain it. Because of the limits of time, we'll talk about a few of them, and if you wish to, you can explore the rest for yourself. The videos should explain most questions. So first of all, we have the aligned text. The aligned text file is a PDF showing every word of every manuscript in the sample, and all the words are aligned according to their shared linguistic roots. When these aligned texts are converted into numbers, we can eventually produce the dendrogram. So we're skipping over a couple of things. So it's that entering of that data and getting it right that ultimately allows us to process the data to produce this. This is a JPEG image depicting the proximity of manuscripts to one another. We've discussed this in some detail, but the colored boxes and overlays represent our working hypotheses about the clusters of manuscripts in this particular book. Each dendrogram has stars that indicate what we call the best representative manuscript of each cluster. Okay, and then we have the THEOT text viewer. We think this is probably the single most effective tool for the study of textual history. And we'll explain more about it later in the presentation. But for each book, we have every bit of information grouped in the clusters that we produce in our analysis. Most important discoveries came from the final 2 artifacts provided on the Type 1 reports pages. And you can watch the videos to see what we discovered and how we discovered it.
You'll experience here the inscrutability of spreadsheets. So it takes a little while to get into the data and understand what it is we're looking at, and then to spot the patterns that are going on that tell stories. And those videos will walk you through our most exciting discoveries in the project.
It's been a key part of the project to find effective ways to visualize data to make it readable for people. Sorry.
Yeah, Ralph, could you, so before that, would it be possible to see, like to choose whether to just see like the oldest variant or to see the most common variant of a reading, or the most, is that what you showed us in the second?
Okay, we will come back to it, but yeah, do you want to click on that again, Stephen? We can sort of do a quick, these are a particular study on what we've called minority variants, which are variants that appear in a small number of manuscripts in the older period, and in many cases are picked up with great enthusiasm in the later period, and that's why they became of interest to us.
Or they are dropped completely in the later period.
And everything in between, I suppose. So the dots simply mark the presence of the variant that's described in the description there on the right-hand side. Okay. So the dot tells you which manuscript and therefore which date that it's associated with. Okay. Does that answer your question, Miriam? Or
yeah, sort of. But if you have a manuscript, do you always have a manuscript that choose one variant? Do you never have one who has both of them, for example, or two or three different, because there have been collating manuscripts themselves, like the scribe? Yeah, do you not have
yeah,
those?
so with those minority variants, we specifically don't choose manuscripts where there's only one manuscript witnesses the variant. We regard that as idiosyncrasy. So in the case of the minority variants, it's at least two and less than half of the manuscripts that witness to it. These ones are of a slightly different kind. These are all what we call innovations of the 17th century. So these are new readings never found in the older manuscripts.
Mm-hmm.
And the main thing to know about these two charts we're just showing you now, the reason they're so important, you remember the dendrogram and how we showed that 85% is uniformity, and it's the last 15% that's responsible for all the diversity in the tradition. If we want to know what are the main mechanisms that cause that diversity, you're looking at the two spreadsheets that explain just about all of it. Just about all of it. It's the minority variants in the early period, and then the new readings of the 17th century. Between those two mechanisms, that explains just about all of the variation on the dendrogram. That's why it's so important. These two reports represent our biggest find. They explain the engines at work that created the diversity.
Thank you.
We can revisit that a bit later on, can't we? I'm aware that of the time, so we've got quite a bit to get through, but I hope it's all of use to you. That was a Type 1 report. The Type 2 reports provide all the data necessary to reach a Type 1 report, but the final analysis required to generate the Type 1 report, these last two spreadsheets, takes a great deal of time. So we've only done those reports for a selection of the books. We had to judge that these were beyond the scope of the THEOT as a mapping project. But having completed 7 of these studies, we're convinced that they contain the primary data related to the unfolding of the textual history. We invite you to enter into the work of describing the character and mechanisms in the other books of the Old Testament. So all the data is there that's necessary. And be sure to look at the bottom of all the report pages. Right at the bottom there, you'll get information about the details of samples of text. So for longer books, we didn't use the whole text. We took a sample across the text. And the manuscripts we used in the study and the discoveries we made regarding clusters and their best represented manuscripts, and about any new minority recensions that are part of that tradition.
So if someone were to ask you, what's the very best manuscript that I should look at for the book of Hosea, you'd have to sort out a little bit what they're looking for, but usually it's going to be this one. The best representative of the earliest attested text form is this manuscript. It represents that cluster most often. And we're just beginning to fill these in because we have transcriptions of all these, not only for the sample, but for the entire book. So when you click on one of these, they will pop up the doc file that includes that transcription. And mine's not working right now, but and yes, and then you can download that transcription onto your computer and have the transcription of that manuscript. But knowing which manuscript you would be interested in, that's the magic that we hope this is some of the best results of the project. Back to you, Ralph.
Actually,
it's over to Gary, isn't it?
Yeah. So now let's look at
a short question, if it's possible.
Sure.
Just out of curiosity, did you try to do several runs of the same book with different sample sizes to see what the difference would be, and where did you settle upon the sample size for the manuscripts? Is that just straight statistics, or is there a specific sweet spot for your field?
We believe we've hit the sweet spot between 30 and 40, but we have run the experiment. If you go into the website and look at the book of Jonah, this is our most extraordinary data set that has a dendrogram with 105 manuscripts in it. Jeremy Brown did this for his dissertation at Catholic University of America. And got these amazing results that are very, very extensive and detailed. But the interesting thing to note is that the basic structure of this emerged by the time we had 15, 20 manuscripts. It became solidified by the time we have 30. And then everything after that is just adding little details within these subunits.
I'll also mention the issue of sample size of text. Like for Deuteronomy, we did not transcribe the entire book of Deuteronomy. For smaller books like Obadiah and Ruth, we did transcribe the entire book. Now, for those larger books, I believe the primary decision there, Kurt Nickham took a look at the Septuagint and identified those places where the most variation happens, suspecting that that would also be the case in the Ethiopic text. And so
I think he also considered Syriac and other traditions related to that, didn't he? But that exactly. So it was an educated guess at what would be the focuses of variation.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ralph. Now let's move on to the Tools tab. So it has been satisfying for us to develop new tools and methods, as it has been to make the discoveries we have about Ethiopia's textual history. But once again, we do not have the time to explore all of these thoroughly. We will look at, first of all, the text viewer. We think that the most useful tool we have created is the THEOT text viewer. It gives us the ability to see all the phenomena of the textual tradition in a single view. Let's take a minute now to look at the text viewer. In the drop-down menu at the top, you can survey the books of the Bible for which we have completed our work. 3 of the 8 books of the Orit, Esther and Job, Psalms, Psalm 151, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel from the prophets, and 11 of the 12 minor prophets, along with a few other works. On the front page of a book in the text viewer, we have put the text of the manuscript that is the best witness to the earliest cluster in our sample. But take a look at the links on the left side of the page. For each of the verse parts, there's a link there, and when you click on those, the text viewer will display every word of every one of the 30 to 40 manuscripts of the study, and they're all aligned by columns according to this having the same ge'ez root. We experimented with a few other ways. I mean, there are possibilities of, if it's a plural noun versus singular noun, you put that in different columns. If it's a verb with a, first person singular object pronoun versus other options. But we ended up settling on, does it have the same ge'ez root? And for our purposes, we felt that this was the best way to study that. So then also, because we did the statistical studies and produced the dendrograms, we can arrange the manuscripts into their clusters. Now you can see all of the uniformity and variation of the tradition in one view. Also, we'd like you to take a look at the data set prepared for the book of Jonah by Jeremy Brown. There are 105 manuscripts, which to me is impressive. Normally we tried for 30, possibly 35, but to have 105 manuscripts for Jonah, I think is great. The data points in that set alone come to 125,000.
There are some questions coming in the chat. I don't know if you want to sort of answer those as you go, or should we like wait till the end and do that as a kind of a question round? It's a little bit up to you, but I don't know if you've seen the.
I have not seen them, Ralph. Do you have them visible in front of you?
Yeah. we can answer these ones briefly now and always come back to them, I suppose. Grant is asking, which transliteration system do we use? And so most of the time we haven't transliterated is the answer to that. But I think what we tend to do is stick with the Encyclopedia Ethiopica transliterations when we do it, and that saves having arguments with significant people. Let's put it like that.
Thanks. Yeah.
Somebody has said as well, do we have a plan to publish critical editions? We don't currently have the resources to do that, but we hope that the data that we've got will provide somebody with the opportunity to do that in the future.
Okay,
keep an
thanks.
eye on them and see if other questions come up. So
Yeah, now we'll go to Daniel.
Okay, thank you. So any project in the digital humanities that create a lot of data must commit itself to the emerging fields of data science and data visualization. On their own, the 1.5 million data points we have created are incomprehensible to the human brain without various levels of statistical analysis and a knowledge of data visualization. So we have developed our project database and data visualization tools side by side. Because of the limits of time, you'll have to explore the database on your own. But here is one thing you need to know about all these spreadsheets in the database. They are constructed so that you can use them immediately to make visualizations with visualization programs. We have used both Salesforce's Tableau and Microsoft Power BI visualization tools to create visualizations. If your institution has a lab for the digital humanities and has people that work with data science and visualization, we can sit down with them and have them connect to these databases within minutes. Let us show you two of the visualizations to illustrate what we can do, or you can do.
So the first that we'll show you here was produced by a master of data visualization. Jared Jacobs is his name. And this is a dashboard created in Tableau that gives all the information about all the manuscripts in the project and the ability for the user to sort of define things. So you can see here we have the number of manuscripts, and this data is actually old right now, but 276 manuscripts from 95 different institutions. Where are those on the world map? Well, you can see by looking in here that they concentrate spread across Christian Ethiopia in its historical expression. And then a chronological filter by which the things can be sorted out. These are for the totality, but if we want to look at a particular book, we click on that, and all of a sudden now we're just looking at the manuscripts used in that study, where they are, what their chronological distribution is, and then we can filter them by other things. So the clusters that there's just a whole lot of research that you can do using this one interface. The other one we'll show is a visualization created in this one's actually in Tableau. The other one was in Microsoft Power BI. Now, like all other data visualizations, they're the best ones you don't have to explain. Like that exercise we did at the beginning, if you set it in front of a person, it ought to speak to the person as they begin to observe. Here's the vertical scale. This is percentage of unique readings. If we're asking the question, how many times across Ethiopia's transmission history do scribes create acts of idiosyncrasy? Do one scribe doing something that nobody else does? Obviously, at the end of the day, we're going to set those acts of scribal idiosyncrasy off to the side and say that's not textual history, that's scribal idiosyncrasy. But how could you visualize that? Well, if you learn, in this case, what a box and whisker plot is, it's a way of laying out the 30 to 40 manuscripts in such a way that you can see how they cluster and the performance of each manuscript so here's the book of Amos, here's the book of Bel and Daniel and Deuteronomy. After a while, it starts to sink in. It's a consistent feature of human behavior to err. Okay, error is going to be with us, but the level of error by this community across 600 copies of books and a whole bunch of scribes across time is consistently between 1% and 2%. That's where the vast majority of the behavior of the scribes plays itself out. You can stare at spreadsheets with ones and twos on them for a long time and not be able to see the answer to the question, how much scribal idiosyncrasy is characteristic of the Ethiopic copying tradition. But in this one visualization, you can see it, and it's all sitting right there before you. And you can see how small are the number of outliers. So it's just data exists to be visualized. Sitting in spreadsheets, it's almost worthless to human comprehension. But that's why it's been very important to us to develop these two things: our database of numbers, and then the visualizations that make sense, make it possible to make sense of the numbers. So I think we're ready to move on to Gary's part.
Okay, yeah, let's take a look at the Methods tab now on the website. So the Methods domain is home to half a dozen tabs. Each one will take you through another aspect of the THEOT project and explain the methods that we developed to carry out our investigation. And again, we're only going to highlight a few. One tab is devoted to the THEOT workflow, and essentially this consists of manual processes and computer processes. Here we provide a host of brief videos that explain project assumptions and working hypotheses, as well as guided tours through just about every step of the workflow itself. Another tab will introduce you to the processes by which we discovered the central findings of the THEOT project about textual history. It's called Processing Data with Spreadsheet Filters. Here you will find 5 videos that walk you through the processes step by step. If you want to really understand the central findings of the project, we recommend you see these videos. Transcribus came up a bit ago, and I'll mention again, Ralph is our resident expert on Transcribus. So it's an AI-based tool for automated transcription of manuscripts. We use the tool extensively, and we're involved in the 2nd generation algorithm trained in Transcribus. So ideas, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Trained specifically for the Ethiopic script. Soon we will provide videos that explain both how the algorithm was developed and how we forged its use into a workflow with a team of transcribers in Addis Ababa who were led by Daniel Asifa.
Right. We should mention that our own Callum Summerson was also involved in training the model on Transcribus. So just to acknowledge where it's appropriate. So the final tab on the homepage leads you to the list of Ethiopic manuscripts that carry the books of the Old Testament. Here we provide links to images and metadata about Ethiopic manuscripts of the Old Testament. The general list of known Ethiopic Old Testament manuscripts is the most important. The sheet currently contains over 400 known manuscripts, not including Psalters. But the data that is present in the spreadsheet needs to be checked for accuracy, and much more metadata needs to be created to produce a true research environment for these manuscripts.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in and say, this spreadsheet will acknowledge it's one of the best out there available on the internet. That'll give you an idea of where things are. The most valuable column, of course, is column J. You simply click on the thing, and there it is. You're looking at the manuscript as it's made available by the holding institution. But I need also to emphasize that there is a lot that needs to be done to bring this the spreadsheet into full accuracy and full information. There's one person in the world, Ted Herho in Hamburg these days, who can do a better job than any of us. And when he releases his list of manuscripts, and you'll want to go use that, because that's what we'll be doing. But in the meantime, there's a lot here, and it's still under construction, but there's a huge amount of information that's here if you're interested in pursuing further a particular book of the Old Testament.
Great. I think that's over to Daniel now, isn't it?
Yeah. Thanks. So to understand the findings of the project, it is necessary to understand the methods we have employed to discover the findings. Here are a few of the key steps that we developed in our digital methods. The website will tell you about several others. For a project like this, you cannot stress too much the importance of accurate transcriptions of the manuscripts in our studies. All our transcriptions went through at least 3 reviews in order to make them as accurate as possible. For the last few years, we have used Transcribus to create the first draft of the transcription of a manuscript. Ralph Lee led the algorithm training process in Transcribus for the second iteration of Go's text recognition platform. Depending on the condition of the manuscript and clarity of the images, the accuracy rate for Transcribus is getting better and better into the high 90s percentile of accuracy. But the transcriptions produced by Transcribus only become the electronic base text for the members of Addis transcription team, led by Daniel Asafa, that means me, and a half dozen of workers. The transcriptions went through at least 3 additional reviews before they were accepted into the project as complete. Special mention goes to Heward Samuel, who played a key role in the finishing part of this process. Special mention also goes to Atodemeka Brahani, who worked directly with Steve de la Mata to produce transcriptions of manuscripts bearing previously unknown minor recensions of Old Testament books. Back to Gary.
Okay. One of the steps in our workflow is creating a digital grid measuring the presence or absence of words in a column. Once we align by hand in a Word document, the various manuscripts, aligning them according to Sank as root, then I wrote a computer script that turns these into 1s and 2s. And there again, a decision was made, we could have, what constitutes the same variant? There again, should we look for, well, if it's a singular noun, it's one variant. If it's a plural noun, it's a different variant. We finally settled on just, is there a word there in the column or not? And so Steve is showing there an example of this. And so decisions that we made, I already mentioned this, which words are compared to which other words. And for our project, we specify this by aligning words in the same column that should be compared to each other. As I mentioned, we did experiment with other options, singular nouns in one column, plural nouns in another, or that kind of thing. Many different grammatical features could have been used, but it seemed like the most basic for us, for what we're trying to do with textual history, it's just, is there a word there or not?
And this is the moment where we move from the literary textual domain into the statistical domain. And this is actually key for everything that happens thereafter. And so understanding how it is we got from words to numbers representing not so much words and their meaning, it's not a code kind of a thing, but the presence or absence of words in columns is what these measurements come down to, and on which the calculations of the rest of the process are made. Ralph?
Yeah. Sorry. All right. You've got a bit more to go, Gary, yeah?
Yeah. Next step, a computer script then analyzes the aligned text and assigns a 1 if there is no word present and a 2 if there is a word present. We reserved 0 to indicate that it cannot be determined whether a word is present or not. For instance, if a page is missing or part of the page is torn away, you simply don't know if there was a word there or not in the original text. I will note that in this case, numbers 1 and 2 are not the kind of numbers you add together to get a sum. It simply represent whether a word is present or not, and in a sense are arbitrary, that it's just a symbol, again, for word present or not. Now, we do use these numbers to answer the question, how many times do 2 manuscripts have the same number, 1 or 2, in the same column? This gives us a measure of how similar one manuscript is another, and it's what the coherence-based genealogical method calls the pre-genealogical measure of affinity. And what else can we do with these numbers? Well, everything.
Now, I'll just say this chart represents this part right here is those 1s and 2s. They are the foundation of our statistical universe. It takes 10 operations to prepare those 1.5 million data points that are on this spreadsheet. But from there forward, everything else that's done in the project is derived from that foundation of those statistics. But as you process them in various ways, from one step to another, meaning emerges. Knowing how to interpret the reports, and if you can focus in on distinctive readings or best representative manuscripts, or to make the text viewer work, all of these are derivative products from that first operation, transforming words into numbers. This is the step where we transfer words into numbers, and over here is where we process them to figure out patterns within the things there. I think, Ralph, you're up next.
Yeah. So if there's anything that ever persuaded you that you needed visualizations, then you're looking at it now. So this table tells us the statistical degree of relationship between every manuscript and every other in the sample. So you'll actually notice there's a line of 100s down the middle, and that represents the relationship of one manuscript to itself. And these are actually symmetrical about that diagonal axis. This data is extremely hard to read, but we export this into the R statistical package, and R produces the visualization that we've already seen a few times, the dendrogram. So this data turns into the next slide, I think, doesn't it? There. Yeah. And that is rather more readable. So I think we've been through quite a few of the details of this already, haven't we, Steve? So we can probably pass on. So that represents, if you like, the processing of all that data into something that we can read and understand.
Yeah, and so I think we've kind of addressed this before, but the black and white tree, I guess, yeah, thank you, Steve. The black and white tree is made by the R statistical package, and then the colored boxes and stars are our interpretation, representing our working hypotheses.
And perhaps what we could do at this point is simply, instead of going through our script, we've alluded to the major findings of the work. And one of those were to explain the uniformity in the tradition, and measure and explain the uniformity of the tradition, and also the variation. And then to try to figure out what caused the variation. And generally, this will kind of complete our presentation. We'll just go straight to discussion now. The biggest thing going on in the tradition is their passion for uniformity. And scribes get up day after day to preserve the traditional text and pass it on to the next generation. And so the entirety of the tradition is marked profoundly by this uniformity. Then you have the phenomena of scribal idiosyncrasy that's responsible for another 0.2 to 2.3% of the text. The final part are those last bits that we've discovered: this minority variance in the ETH1 period, standardized editors, the standardizing of the text, and then finally, creating new readings in the 17th century. offer the details to the rest of the story, but you got to sort of pay your dues to get into understanding what those are. But that's where I think at this point we do well to open it up and ask for, first of all, if any members of the team have something from the end of the presentation that you really want to make sure gets emphasized. Otherwise, we'll give an opportunity for some respondents. I believe Callum is ready, and perhaps Miriam to give us some input. So let's do that. And I think for this part of the presentation, I want to stop sharing, and I will unpin the major presenters here, and that will get everyone on the same thing. So Callum, we're moving to you here just as quickly as I can remove the pins from things here. Where is the pin and remove pin? So there we go. There is the full group. Cal, to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you all for this tremendous work you've accomplished. As Ralph mentioned, I've spent a little bit of time helping to train and run and check the Transcribus software, mostly on manuscripts of Zechariah. So I can really appreciate the vast amount of work and time and effort that's gone into it. And I think you've produced something that's going to be really, really valuable for future generations and study in the area of Ethiopic and Ethiopian studies. I've spent the last few days looking through various aspects of the website, and I've managed to look through almost all of the minority variants and every single one of the new readings for the Type 1 reports. I have many questions, many thoughts, but based upon my examination, I wanted to offer some observations and suggestions, after which I will then ask 3 questions. My first observation relates to different types of new readings that occur in the manuscripts of the Type 1 reports. Generally, I found that these relate to clarity, issues of clarity, issues of logic, issues of what I'm calling piety, and then issues of contextualization. Unsurprisingly, the new readings dealing with clarity and logic, these first 2 types I'm describing here, usually involve small adjustments to grammar, a lot of additions or subtractions of pronouns, prepositions, and then there are many instances in changes or adjustments to spelling of proper nouns. Changes of the type that I am provisionally labeling as piety usually revolve around the divine titles for God, with interesting variation in the main 3 Ethiopic titles, those being Amlak, Exia, and Exiabher. Most interesting to me personally are new readings that deal with what I'm calling contextualization in Ethiopia. Some of these insist that lions live in forests, not in pits. Some of these clarify what a hyrax actually is in the dietary laws of Deuteronomy. And others make sure that the reed plant, so common along the rivers and lakes of Ethiopia, is correctly identified and understood. Based upon these very preliminary observations, I suggest that organizing variants and new readings in a similar fashion to this might make your research a little bit more accessible to a broader audience and could possibly facilitate the discovery of more and different important patterns. My second observation is shorter. It relates to the relationship between the Septuagint and other versions of the Old Testament. Many of the new readings I have examined appear on the surface to oscillate between major differences or just differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. But I know that this might be something we discuss. There's debate regarding how much Hebrew Ethiopian translators and editors have known at different stages of history. So I think it might be beneficial to make more explicit some of the correlations to other Semitic traditions, in particular the Syriac and the Arabic, most importantly. especially because of the growing literature and knowledge about the translation of various Ethiopic texts, such as the monastic texts that I work on, having come from Arabic forlag in almost all of the cases that we know for the monastic texts, the major monastic texts. So if you make that more explicit, considering, so, and this is also something for the benefit of others, many of these new readings that appear, it was mentioned with kind of out of nowhere, it seems. They're not coming from minority variants earlier in history, seem to be adjusted based upon either some of the Hebrew manuscripts or some Arabic manuscripts. It seems, but I know lots more work is needed to discern that more clearly. Now, 3 questions, and I'll be done with my time. You can choose to ignore some of these if you'd like. I'd be interested, partly because of my own interests and those of some of my colleagues, in your opinion, what the most significant theological finding of the project is so far. Question number 2, I'd be curious to know how much work you've done on scribal and paleographic conventions that are consistent or characteristic with different clusters, or how much work would it take to do something like that at this stage of the project? And then finally, my last question, looking forward, I'd love to hear about your highest hopes for the future of this project. What happens from here on out? Will more of these type 1 reports be produced? And how do you envision this could kind of grow in interdisciplinary ways? Thank you so much once again. That's all that I have prepared.
Callum, that is huge. And we consider ourselves a mapping project and almost like servers at the restaurant who bring out the food and then let you do with it what you will. And you've identified some wonderful areas for further exploration and some further clarification. This is exactly what we hope will happen through the efforts of others. We've spent 13 amazingly tedious years of working this stuff and working out workflows and so on and so forth. Daniel, I wonder if you'd respond to the question, theological findings or scribal conventions. What came to your mind, Daniel, as Callum was giving his list of observations?
I think, as you just said, one has to work more if one was to look for theological findings. But for instance, as Callum mentioned, the question of piety, where you have got different terms for the deity, I think one can make some research to see whether there are some types of emphasis on one way or another. The other thing is, for instance, the 2 manuscripts or the 3 manuscripts, which are almost 40%, which show that 40% of difference, translated from the Latin Vulgate, have also introductions, and one, I think, should explore that to see whether there are intentional theological differences or so. I mean, between brackets, for instance, I was looking for the book of Exodus to compare the new the modern Textus Receptus and the last Giz Bible, compared to what is called Asmara Bible, which is also takes into consideration Ethiopian manuscripts. But to my amazement, in the book of Exodus, I found about 100 times the term exi to mean the Lord, whereas you have it only 10 times in the Textus Receptus, which is almost 10 times more. So I think there is something to explore and to discover if one was, but that is, as I said, everything is on the table. and people have to look for some kind of questions, research questions, and explore them. Also, regarding the paleography, I think, given that we will make available very ancient manuscripts, I think students who are interested in paleography will have at their disposal both the transcription and the image of the manuscripts, and can make some kind of interesting research and work.
Good.
Ralph.
Just picking up on what Daniel said, you'd have to expand your question about theology to also sociological. There's actually a project in Germany that's picked up on some material that we've already used, and is interested in how animals' names are translated and transcribed. And they've expressed an interest, particularly in the list of unclean and clean animals in Deuteronomy,
Yes.
which isn't always of great theological interest to contemporary people, but nevertheless, it shows you the sort of thing. We had a diversion, didn't we, a while ago? One of the words there appears to be a transliteration of a word for a crocodile, and we were wondering why there would be crocodiles in the mentioned, and we're not absolutely sure that it is any longer. But of course, if it is a representation of crocodile, then you've got something about Ethiopians worrying about whether they can eat crocodiles or not, given that they're present in the Nile, and that's a sociological interest. So that was just an example. So somebody's already picked up on some of that data.
Gary, did you have any, what ideas were prompted as you're listening to Callum? You're muted, Gary.
Yes, thank you. Well, what comes to my mind, so I'm the computer programmer for the project, and as has been discussed, we have a large database of the texts, and so to do some analysis, so for instance, related to orthography, Jared Jacobs and I did a study, it's maybe been close to 10 years, where it counts up across chronology the different uses of certain words, and also orthography. I think I'm kind of thinking of several projects we worked on, the spelling of various words and seeing how that changed across time, especially the sound-alike letters.
Yes.
Which scribes, in later Ge'ez and then in Amharic, maybe not so much in Tigrinya, but in Amharic, certain letters came to be pronounced alike. And then scribes who might not have been as familiar with Ge'ez would then often interchange them. And so we did. Anyway, what I'm getting at is we've got a large database that could be analyzed by computer to bring out various aspects.
Yeah, if I may add something,
Please.
For the best representatives, we have also some material where in the footnotes there are observations on the variants, some of which I think can be explained either. They might be caused for theological reasons or question of Vorlage, etc. And I think looking at the footnotes can help people explore a lot of interesting things, be it in text critically, philological, but also maybe surely theological reasons.
For my part, and then we'll move on to Miriam if she's going to share some ideas as well. I look at sort of a social sciences approach to it. Imagine the amazing privilege it would be if you were a time machine was put at your disposal, and you could go and grab 30 scribes that represent 700 years of labor transmitting the text in Ethiopia. You get all those people together and they'd sit in a room and say, we're going to go word by word through the text here, and each of you gets to tell us what your word is. And then let's look and see if we can see patterns. It's this rising above and being able to look down on the behavior. And I tell you, I have these moments of profound humbleness at the life labors of these 30 to 40 individuals sitting there on the on manuscript parchments in front of us, and seeing, knowing something about the conditions in which they lived, knowing the intellectual feats. They didn't have computers. They carried phenomenal amounts of information in their head. Their understanding of the language, tied up with poetic practices and so on. This is one of the most fascinating things to me. I end up going away with this profound sense of reverence for people passionate about the transmission of the word, for clarity of the word, for contextualization of the word, to bring it. So it's a study of the path of God's word into and through Ethiopian culture across a great duration of time. And I think that gives a magnificent perspective of breadth that isn't easy to achieve. Am I correct in thinking that there was maybe one more respondent? Miriam, is that you?
Hi.
There we go.
Well, I don't know if I was an official respondent, but I had quite a few reactions to this, which first of all, I think it's such an impressive work. I mean, I was really stunned by all the amazing work you have put into this project, and all the data you put in, everything you can get out. And I really think digital humanities and these sort of projects is really the future. I mean, the present already, of course, but also really the future of Eastern Christian studies in general, because we just don't have, in none of our traditions we really have control of. So we need to do this in Arabic, in Syriac, in Church Slavonic, in Greek. There are, of course, projects, but there are just so much material. So I was both stunned and impressed and a little bit stressed over the fact that, we all need to do this sort of work before we go and do the sort of secondary analysis that most of us just, throw ourselves in. My questions, I had many questions, but for one question is related to the dating of the manuscripts, because it seems like many of them were undated. Is it that easy to date the manuscripts? It's really from the 16th century or 17th century, which would be a huge problem in Arabic, for example. I was also wondering about the bilingual, is it common with bilingual Bible manuscripts in the Ethiopic traditions of any kind? And my third question was really now when AI techniques are developing so rapidly, and we're just, so many projects just training on manuscript materials as well. Will this affect your findings somehow? Will you continue? Will you do something new? Will you be able to sort of take in this new technique, or do you feel like you're finished now with this really, really impressive project? Yeah, that was it. Thanks.
Wow.
Thank you.
I'll say a word about the last piece. The last person that shows up in our personnel is in the Netherlands. Gary, help me remember his name.
Martijn.
Yeah, Martijn Nijer, yeah. Who is a specialist with interest in AI. For us, one of the most difficult parts of our process, as we explained, is that alignment of words into columns. Say, nothing could be more tedious. And I swear, because it fell to me to do a lot of the first drafts with lots of errors, but first draft. And it takes 40 hours for every book. You've got all these things you have to sit and push things around with processes and doc files, and it's a hugely time-consuming, tedious, seemingly meaningless, and yet ultimately it's going to be the thing that provides the statistical foundation, the entire enterprise. Oh, what a help it would be! So we've given him a set of before and afters. AI is all about training models, right? You have to train, let the computer figure out what's going on there, but or develop an algorithm to figure out what's going on. But you have to provide it with training information. So we have before and afters. Here's the text just sitting, all sitting there together for each verse part for all the manuscripts, and here's then the final dots and bars, we call it, are where we've shoved everything around, got them lined up into columns. That's our training module. We've given him about 25 data sets of this before and after, and he's begun to work on applying AI to see if we can develop a tool that can do even 80% of that work. Would be a huge time reducer. That's one of the ways in which.
Yeah, and I'll add to that also. So I was in Amsterdam at the International SBL and met with some of Martijn's colleagues, Constantine, Yorick, Yusuf, Willem, if you know any of these people. And they have developed already a parsing program using artificial intelligence for both Hebrew and Syriac. And they have an interest in doing a similar thing for Ge'ez, which... Yeah, I'm kind of excited about that. I'm not directly involved in that, but we've had some discussions, and I'm interested to see what progress can be made in that.
Grant, did you have some input about these questions or an observation of your own?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, actually, I'll put my hand down here. First of all, I just am in awe of all of the work that you put in on this. It's just mind-blowing, and just add my congratulations to all the members of the project. And I just have to say, as somebody who studies liturgy, it seems to me that the data that this project provides could be enormously useful for ascertaining everything from the provenance of prayers to theological and liturgical developments within basically that big question of the interaction between scriptural text and liturgical text that is still just in its infancy in many traditions. And so, this is going to be hugely, hugely important to those who want to explore the Ge'ez liturgical traditions in that particular light. So all I can say is thank you.
Thank you. Callum. Sorry. Ralph.
Yeah. A couple of things in terms of what can emerge out of it. There's some things that we've already begun to explore, and then quite often got pulled in to do things, and then realised that what we really need to do was just get on with producing our data. But talking about the influences of other translations and that question, if you look closely at the data on Deuteronomy, you'll find that we did an extra study on Deuteronomy chapter 32. The reason that came about was because it's one of the biblical canticles, and we noticed that there was if you like, the dendrogram that relates to chapter 32 is rather different. And we had good data for several reasons. Just for chapter 32, we actually had a fragment that Lawrence Stuckenbrook dug up in a hole in a monastery in northern Ethiopia, which is probably 10th century. It's just a few pages, but it coincided with chapter 32. So that gave us a much older source in this particular case. But it does seem that the canticle text is somewhat influenced by prayer books, which of course carry versions of the canticles. And there's some evidence that an Arabic version of the prayer book was translated, and that has impacted on the text. So there's some interesting interactions there that we've touched on a little bit, I suppose. And Steve, there's another story related to that, isn't there, about the Song of Songs and the different recensions there? Because Song of Songs is the most copied book in the whole Ethiopic tradition, I think, isn't it? Because it appears in three things. It appears in the Passion Week readings, it appears in Psalters, and it appears in biblical manuscripts.
And in Ginzit manuscripts as well. It's the most copied. And we just Others had observed that there are two versions of it, the common edition, which corresponds very closely to the Greek tradition. A second one referred to either as the Hebraist or the Scholars Edition, which starting at about chapter 2, verse 14, has 130 or so different strophes throughout that are additional. And nobody knew exactly where they came from. We tripped across EMMO 2064, is that the manuscript that has we think the best witness to what we call the old Georgos recension. We believe that the person behind that that Hebraist edition and its additional strophes was Georgos of Gassica, and that for some reason, at some point, what became the Hebraist edition, for which we can find probably 40, 50 different, we can find lots of manuscripts that carry that Hebraist edition of the Song of Songs. But the old Georgos recension that has all of the innovations of Georgos of Gassica, starting at chapter 1, verse 3 or something like that, is only in a few old manuscripts, and then remnants of it scattered throughout a bunch of other manuscripts. So there's and it's a marvelous work of literary finesse. I mean, Georgos of Gassica is like simultaneously, this highest theologian, Johannes Afewerk, kind of a figure, and also a literary genius on the level of Shakespeare or something else. And so it's just another witness to a vibrant community bringing all kinds of efforts to bear on the glorification of the text, I might say. Miriam, did you want to raise any further follow-up questions or observations from the discussion here?
I did not understand. I want to make sure. I think you mentioned bilingual. Did you mean whether there are manuscripts where we have to written in two languages?
Yes. I assumed you have. There are, of course, some.
Yeah, there are, of course.
Yeah.
Even the polyglot, even the Ambrosianus have, I think, 5 languages.
Yes. Is that common in the Ethiopic tradition that you have bilingual or trilingual from your data?
From the 17th century onward, we begin to get Ge'ez and Amharic editions for lots of works. Now they represent, well less than 5% of the manuscript tradition. Nevertheless, there's consistent, you can pull together and find that Ge'ez and Amharic thing. Nothing else in Ethiopia that I'm familiar with. You have these extraordinary manuscripts in the one at the Vatican and Ambrosianus and others but those seem to be centered in somebody else's agenda. Those polyglots, they're not a part of an endemic to Ethiopian culture.
Thank you.
There's one trailing question just from the chat, which
Thank
was
you,
from Barakat about determining what the Old Testament was translated from, and I think we are clear that the origin is definitely the Greek, the Septuagint, although the Septuagint is a misnomer, isn't it? Which one? And that we're not clear about. I think Kurt has pinned down a couple of readings to particular versions there. But it's not as simple as that, is it? It's not just that there are places where it doesn't agree with the Septuagint, and I think it's fair to say we don't really know at the moment where those differences arise from. But one of our problems we pointed to, isn't it, is that the extant manuscript tradition, barring a few exceptions, is about 1,000 years after the original translation. So we struggle we're absolutely convinced that there are more stages of revision in those 1,000 years, and we don't have any data on those. So
we pointed out two perspectives of interest. Those that are interested in studying the origins of the tradition in the Septuagint and the relation of that to the Hebrew, and those who are interested in the emergence of the tradition. And it would take a long time to explain, but we become very uncomfortable with the practice of those who are looking at producing critical editions of the original or the earliest attested form of the text. That they can never shift out of that perspective, and they'll say sentences that on the face of it are absurd. This manuscript from the 15th century witnesses to the Greek reading, blah, 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 blah. Well, no, it doesn't. It can't possibly. It may have ghosts preserved in the text, the ghosts of ancient ancestor texts that are preserved. But that tradent, that scribe in the 14th, 15th century was not looking at a Greek manuscript, have no evidence of the presence of the living Greek tradition being analyzed. And so at some point you have to stop using the language referring to the origin of the text to explain the phenomena of the later text, and look at it on its own terms. And what are the mechanisms driving its variations as they go forward? And they have everything to do with those final two spreadsheets. The existence of variants that emerged somewhere or another by the 14th century. We have at least two schools for every book with slightly different lists of variants between them. And then in the 17th century, a revisionist agenda forced on them, probably through, in part, by contact with the Jesuits and arguments about the who's got the best Bible and what the best Bible looks like and all that kind of thing. Anyway, there's just all kinds of fascinating stuff there. Daniel.
I just wanted to also say that Samuel has had his hand up for a while, and
he
also
has, yes, I've just pointed that out. Yes.
We should also hear if there are any questions from the room before we sort of end. Yeah. So, but Samuel, I think, should.
Please.
Thank you very much. This was really impressive and instructive. And having worked quite a lot with the digital tools not for biblical text, but for monastic texts, including some Ethiopic, this is highly interesting. But I would like to pursue one of Miriam's questions, actually, the question of other languages and their role, especially here Arabic. Did you look into the issue of some influence in the emergence, in the tradition, in the variants that occur from Arabic versions, having influenced revisions? Or are there even revisions that you can spot, excluding these modern Catholic ones, but earlier ones that can have to do with other languages that the scribes have encountered? I guess Arabic is a natural, but of course, thinking of the Jesuit time, if there are things coming from the Latin or from other versions, did you compare with other versions of biblical manuscripts?
Generally, we rule that out of bounds. That's a huge domain in and of itself, and our calling was to just be faithful to the Ethiopic and create something then against which others could do this sort of work. Daniel, you had wanted to respond.
Yeah. Having said that, there is, for instance, one exception, which we also mentioned. Normally, the Ethiopian traditional commentaries have a Ge'ez Amharic commentaries, but there is the commentary for the book of Ezekiel differs from all other commentaries, whereas the others rely mainly on the Greek text. The known now, the published commentary of the book of Ezekiel, the Ge'ez text is a direct translation from the Masoretic text. So the one who prepared the commentary lived in Jerusalem. He was called by Emperor Haile Selassie at the beginning of the 20th century. He was living at the end of the 19th century, and he purposely translated a new text directly from the Hebrew, which is totally different from even the modern Textus Receptus. And then he explains in Amharic. And we have also this data in our, I think, in our production.
Well, I think it's time for us to turn things back over to our hosts and say thank you so much for giving us.
We have one more question, Steve, before you go there. If you excuse me. There was someone in the room. Yeah, of course.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for your tremendous work. Now I want to learn Ges and join you, but that won't happen. I don't have time for that. Quick question. You worked on the Old Testament, and do you know, are there any ideas or initiatives for the text of the New Testament in Ges? I'm asking because I'm not sure if you know, but in Münster, this New Testament Textological Institute is doing now the Editio Critica Maior, EMC of the New Testament, and they claim they are including some variants from Ges. Do you know what they're working on? Is their project similar to yours, or are there any other projects in mapping the textual tradition of the New Testament in Ethiopia? Thank you.
In this regard, we'd have to mention our former colleague, Kurt Nickham. He is the person on that committee who brings this information to them for their consideration. Do other members of the team or anyone else know of other initiatives being carried out in a digital humanities way related to? Ulrich Schmidt has been a leader in the digital workspaces that facilitate this kind of work for scholars in Europe, on the continent, especially in Germany. Anybody else? Gary, do you have other knowledge of?
No, I don't. I was thinking also of Kurt, but otherwise, no.
Kurt's just recently published in the Festschrift, hasn't he? A big article on the Garima Gospels and the Gospel texts, which is very interesting. So he's carrying on with that sort of work to a large extent. For those that don't know, the Garima Gospels are a very old witness to the Gospel text, possibly 6th century, and that's an exceptional find. So that is there, but I don't think there's anything systematic or organized about this, is there? That's the thing, that it's individuals who have taken up particular interest. So.
Thank you. We have one super short question left in the room.
Thank you.
I think what about the liturgical books, manuscripts, because we have a lot, many. Do you have any idea? Do you have any projects to revive? I don't know, to do something on the liturgical boxes.
Yeah.
Did you hear? He asked you about the liturgical manuscripts.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So one of my projects prior to this one was Ethiopic Manuscript Imaging Project, in which we located and digitized something over 12,000 manuscripts. There are tons of interesting, my focus has been narrowly biblical stuff, but these kinds of liturgical texts, the manuscripts, the anaphoras, for the missal, every one of them is their own interesting study in variation and uniformity and other categories. I was thinking of the Aslet manuscripts. What's that translation? The lectionary manuscripts where the biblical text is arranged according to the needs of the church year. There's a whole genre of things that would be fascinating for the comparison. Ralph already referred to the 15 biblical canticles that are part of the Ethiopic Psalter, which makes them part of the canon within the canon, so to speak, within the Ethiopic tradition. There's really only one book, that's the Psalter, that is likely to be in the hands, have been in the hands of almost everybody in the culture. Maybe as many as 30% of all the books ever produced in Ethiopia were Psalters. And the fact that the Psalters have, Psalms, Song of Songs, 15 biblical canticles, they know the Bible and the relationship then of the canticle versions compared to the version found in biblical texts is a fascinating study. We've carried out some studies of that. Others ideas?
I think it's fair to say that the scripts and methods that we've developed could easily be used for liturgical text, couldn't they? You could do the same thing and transcribe and align and so on. You might have to refine the methodology a bit, but it could be worked. But we don't have the plan to do that. But we'd be very happy to support somebody who takes that particular mantle. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. And I might point out that we're contributing right now to Nassina Gruder's project in Switzerland, to Dalit Ramshaloni's project on the Beta Israel community in Israel and their manuscript tradition. We're contributing to these other kinds of works that are going on. And every one of them is a Macedonian call into some unevangelized area that needs to be explored. And we just say, oh, God, help us raise up laborers for the fields are white unto harvest, right?
That we know we just got. Now you spurred one more question from the room.
Oh,
if we could just steal 1 more minute from 2.
I guess that's gonna have to be the last one.
Then. Yes, very short one.
Very short one. Actually, in the Ethiopian scriptural tradition, there are variations actually with the historiography in general, actually, because the tradition and the normal history of texts have a very huge difference. So how the project is going to manage this difference, because the tradition is there in the texts, and here the history is going to be even quantified into numerical values and get into a data. So how it is going to be reconciled?
Should we take the second question as well, so that we have the 2 questions in hand? Did you hear the question, the first question?
Yes.
Good. And the second question?
Thank you very much. I also appreciate shortly your emphasis and attention to this neglected area of study, the Giz texts, not a topic for me, Giz texts. That's one question maybe for you and for all of us. Why we are calling the texts Ethiopic texts? We do not have Ethiopic language. Rather, we have Giz language. If you ask anyone, scholars in Ethiopia, Ethiopian scholars, they may not say the Ethiopic language. And there is no Ethiopic language. We have Giz language. So why we give this name, just like Syriac, Arabic, Aramaic, and then Ethiopic, just to fit with those kind of language, or just it's intentional? It's just out of the book. Another question is, there are in the Old Testament in Ethiopic, I mean in the Giz canon, the Jubilees and the Book of Enoch. Does your data include these books? And can I last one?
We take this too, because you can write them.
Just we could say a word about the last question. Yes, Book of Tobit, Bel and the Dragon, the extensions to the Book of Daniel are carefully studied. The Azariah and the Song of the Three Children is completely studied, as is Susanna and Bel. There's so much more. The Enoch. Go ahead, Daniel.
Enoch and Jubilees, more than any other Giz texts, have had the privilege of many or several critical editions. So there is no need for us to work on that, because there are so many editions of Enoch and Jubilees.
In fact, there's a new edition of Enoch imminent.
Yes.
When Lawrence Stuckenbrook gets
and I think also for the word Ethiopic, I think it comes from the Western, from Europe, no? The Ethiopische Grammatik in Ethiopia. It's not in Ethiopia that I think this name was given, but because we are working now in English, I think that's why we used it.
Yeah, we inherited some vocabulary that is usefulness is probably. Was the first question was the gentleman referring to the Abinit tradition of the awareness in the tradition of variance?
Tradition and historiography, how it is going to be reconciled.
Okay. Ralph has done a bit of work on Abinit. Maybe you can speak to that. I'm not sure we can address the whole thing or have addressed, but Ralph.
Yeah, it's something we've not. So if you look in the commentary tradition, quite often, sometimes described with the word Abinit and sometimes not. The commentary will describe various readings without explanation. So, for instance, in the beginning of Genesis, where it talks about everything is good and the word sonite is used, one of the commentary says andam tov yilal. It just says one says tov. It uses the Hebrew word, but doesn't give any explanation. We have not been able to correlate those variations with things we find in the manuscript tradition, and so they remain of great interest. But at the moment, we're not quite sure where to sit them in this study. I think it's fair to say, isn't it? Very much a desiderata. In fact, it would be really a wonderful project to go through the printed editions of commentaries and record those variations and to get a bigger picture. That would be a really, really interesting project, even just for one book of the Bible. It would be good to do.
Thank you.
All right. I think the time has come now for us to say thank you so much to Steve, Daniel, Ralph, and Gary. This has been such a rich and inspiring and fascinating 2 hours. And as you all, we're all noticing, we could have continued for an hour or more after this too, I think. I mean, it spurs so many questions and hopefully also a lot of new research in the future. I mean, this really feels like a starting point for a lot of new and interesting avenues. So thank you so much for sharing all this with us. It's been so great, and I hope you will come back to us with more if you have more in the future.
Pleasure.
Yeah,
we are going. Did you want to say something, Steve?
Well, if you have students who are looking for projects, we're just laid out all kinds of things that people can take up. We want to be plagiarized, and well, maybe not plagiarized, but we would love for people to take the material and do those next jobs that need to be done. Cal, the typology that you laid out is just brilliant as a starting point for begin to understanding the agendas that are brought to the text and how they're expressed themselves in variations. There are just hundreds of projects calling out to be done. And our job is to serve them up, and we can't do them all ourselves. So, Tom, back to you, Thomas.
And we should also say thank you to Callum because he brought up some very important points and reflections here, which I at least thought were very useful also as a way to continue thinking about what you're doing. This is our last seminar in October, and we're not meeting until November 12th. So that's 3 weeks from now. But before that, all of you at St. Ignatius who are planning to do a research application, you need to